here is one thing. At some point, I will go very quickly through my slides, but this is one of the few things on which I want to insist. There is one empirical difficulty, and let me try to give you an intuition of this empirical difficulty. That's about this idea that I can just regress individual consumption on aggregate consumption and individual income, and if I see that the coefficient of individual income is significant, this must be that risk sharing is efficient risk sharing is not taking place in this economy. Now that's completely wrong. Let me try to convince you that it's completely wrong. Assume that I'm sharing risk with Natalie. And assume that we have completely different income processes. So her income process is completely different. My income process has the same mean, but sometimes it's high, and then all of a sudden it can drop very low. And then it goes back here. So in other words, she's not facing risk and I'm facing risk. Which makes a lot of sense because that is precisely the reason why I want to share risk with her. Essentially what I'm trying to do is buy insurance for her. Now, even if the expected income in both cases is the same, since I am buying insurance from her, you would expect that I'm going to pay for this insurance. So you would expect that my consumption should be slightly below here, and her consumption should be slightly above. The difference between them being the premium that I'm paying to be covered against risk. Fine. Now, assume that instead of the two of us, there is a very large population which is made of clones of me and clones of Natalie. Right? So we got this, and the population and the shocks are independent. Just to make my life easier, the shocks are completely independent, so that the law of large numbers applies, and the total resources at the economy level is basically constant. So that's the situation in which we can achieve perfect risk sharing. So that's a situation in which the mutuality principle tells you the income should not vary in response to income shock. My consumption should not vary in response to income shock. Because the only thing that matters are resources at the collectivity level, but resources at the collectivity level do not vary because of this diversification. Let's assume that is the case. So let's assume that my consumption is constant at this level, and the consumption not only of me but of my clones, and the consumption of Natalie's clones is constant at that level. Okay? Now assume that an econometrician comes and looks at data. And what does this econometrician see? The econometrician sees, first of all, some people who have an income here and the consumption here. Then some people who have an income here and the consumption here. And then some people who have an income there and the consumption here. Assume you run a regression like this, and you ask yourself, is there a correlation between consumption and income? The answer will be yes. Especially assume that those two levels here are very close to each other. So there is not much difference between them, and since there is some noise, there is no way you can distinguish this income from that income. But definitely that one you will see is singled out, because those are the catastrophic period. What you see is a bunch of people with pretty much the same income and pretty much the same consumption level. On average here, some people are slightly above, some people are slightly below. And these are all Natalie's clones plus the lucky clones of myself, the clones of my clones which happen to have an income there. Then what about my clones who happen to have an income there? They're exactly at the same consumption level. But what you see is, among those people with the income up there, the consumption is all over the place. Among the people who have the low income, the consumption is constantly at the low level. You run any regression here, you find a positive coefficient between income and consumption. That's completely spurious, because again, that's an economy in which there is perfect risk sharing. Now, what's the nature of the... so this is simply the fact that if you run the regression, and tons of papers have done that, when you run this regression, cross-sectional data without paying attention, you might end up with a completely spurious correlation. Now, what's the story here? Here we need to understand a little bit the theory. What's the theory? The theory tells you the following. First of all, we know that efficiency in terms of allocation means that we're maximizing a weighted sum of expected utility, and each person's at a Pareto weight. Okay, that's step. Next step. If there is efficiency, the Pareto weight should not depend on the realization of the shock. That's exactly what insurance is about. My weight in the economy does not depend on whether I've been lucky or not. That's exactly the definition of insurance in the sense of the fact that the Pareto weights are a constant, even though the realization of income is different. So Pareto weights do not depend on realization of income. Of course, they do depend on the distribution of income. For exactly the same reason that my Pareto weight in this kind of agreement is likely to be lower than Natalie's just because I am the one who has this kind of very unequal distribution of income. So this is a subtle difference because this tells you efficient resharing means that consumption should not depend on the realization of income, but at the same time, standard bargaining theory tells us that when you sign a contract with someone ex ante, before the risk is realized, it's certainly the case that the contract that you sign takes into account the kind of distribution of risk of each person. So definitely the Pareto weight, therefore the consumption, will depend on the distribution of the shocks. In other words, whenever you want to test this prediction, you have to be able to distinguish between the distribution of the shock and the realization of the shock. That's exactly the story here. The reason why those people have a low consumption is not because they have a low income. Actually, even if their income was there, they would have the same consumption. The reason why those people have a low consumption is because they have a low Pareto weight, and they have a low Pareto weight because their distribution is the one with the risk of a large catastrophe. But the question is, can you distinguish those two things empirically? And now it should be completely obvious that if I have cross-section, there is no way I can distinguish. There is no way I can distinguish between a realization and the characteristics of the random process generating this realization if I have only one realization.